So to create the slicer, we need additional space because the slicer is a special visual that will have an impact onto these two visuals we created in here. So let's select the left visual and drag it down a bit like this maybe. And let's also do the same thing for the right visual here. Here we go. So let's put it to the same level. And now the slicer is a visual that allows us to specifically tailor the information displayed in other visuals. Now this sounds a bit strange actually, but if we quickly create the slicer now, the slicer symbol is this one here, so this visualization with the filter symbol. So if we select this, we by default get this empty visual here, which we can, as always, drag around here. I'll put it right here. And the special thing about the slicer is that we can only add one single field to this visual. In our case, I will use a field from the fact population column, and this is our year field. So we can drag this to the field here or directly to the slicer visual. And now, with that field being added, you immediately see what the slicer is all about. The slicer for the year field here that we are using allows us to specifically tailor a range of years that is being displayed in our visuals. So if I use the slicer here, I can change the starting date. In the left visual, you now see that we start in the year 2015 now in our chart. And if I do this from the upper range, so to say, we also reduce the last year, now to 2029. In the right visual, it's not that easy to see, but this also changes the data displayed in this visual. You can see it right here. It is important to note that this interaction only works as in the format ribbon here. When selecting the slicer, we activated the added interactions menu. So if I click right here and then, for example, turn these two none and none for the slicer visual, then I can play around as I want to. It doesn't have an impact onto these visuals. So therefore, keep the interactions in mind. These allow you to also enable an interaction with such a slicer visual. I'll reactivate the filtering logic though, as the slicer doesn't make too much sense otherwise. Besides changing the years with that slicer, you can also manually enter data into these fields if you want to. But this is just the default slicer view. You have different ways to display this slicer visual, and you can access these by clicking onto this lower arrow here. By the way, this symbol here simply allows you to get back your changes you made to the default ones. But in this menu, you have now 5 options basically about the way the slicer is displayed and how it works. The default one is this between selection that we have, so we can select a range between a starting and an ending date, so to say. The other option would be a list, which is a simple list, which is not readable at the moment, which is, not the perfect selection here, as with the default formatting with that innovate theme, we can't see anything. But you can see that we have the years in here. So here I could select the year 2011, for example, but not really good readable. The second one would be a drop down, basically the same logic, but also not really good readable. We'll format this in a few seconds. But here you can also individually select the different years. We also have, in addition to between, this less than or equal to, so here we can only set the maximum value, or with greater than or equal to, we can only set the minimum value. I would like to go with the list option though right here, and now format this in a way that we can read it. The first thing is that I don't like the orientation of these years now. I would like to display these differently. For this, I can go to the format options here. And there I first want to go to the values, by the way, and change the font color from this gray one to a white one. Now we can at least read the years. But what I don't like is the, general look of that slicer. For that, if we close our values menu and go to the slicer settings, I can change the orientation. The default vertical orientation can be changed to horizontal. And there we see that these tick boxes disappear, and instead we can now directly select the year in our slicer. I think that's a more intuitive approach, therefore I'd like to follow this one here. And by the way, we can also unselect the Edit Interactions option. Now with this different, orientation style, we can now also add the slicer to the top here maybe, drag it to the right, and now decrease the size a bit, maybe to 2 lines. And now we could make it smaller or bigger. If we make it smaller, we can navigate through the years by clicking onto this arrow here, but I will use the entire space we have. So add the slicer like this. Maybe make it a bit smaller. Now with the slicer being on top, we can select the individual years easily. For example, year 2024, 2028. So we always select the single year. You can see this with this left chart. So always the year I just selected is active. And the problem is that with the default formatting, it's hard to see what year we actually selected. Therefore, let's again go to the Format menu. I'll first go to the Values option here inside the Visual Settings. And there, with the background menu down here, we could change this to, a slight gray tone, for example. Oh, that's a bit too bright, so let's change it to this slightly darker one. And now things are better already. Now we see that when we select a specific year, this year is highlighted in this black tone. And I think this is, a lot easier to understand the slicer visual now. So this is a visual improvement, but if we again scroll up a bit, close the values, and go again to the slicer settings, we see that we have, in addition to the options, also this selection menu. In this selection menu, we see that the default, selection is single select off, multi-select on, and show select all off. Now, with these default settings, by clicking on an individual value, in our case a year, only this year is selected. If we now hold the Control key on the keyboard, we can select multiple years in our visual. You can see this in the left chart here. Now we have the years from 2030 up to 2036. And if I again press and hold the Control key, I can unselect individual years. If I select another year, 2026 for example, the other years are unselected. If I would unselect this multi-select option, I can select multiple years without holding the Control key, which is a bit, unintuitive, because if I now want to select an individual year, I have to reselect all the selected years to get back to this initial value. Therefore, this is not my preferred setting, to be honest. I either like to use the single select only, so here I can only select one single year, or I unselect this and enable the multi-select with Control option. With that, we can easily select and unselect individual years. Besides that, we also have the Show Select All option. If I enable this, I get this Select All button. If I click this, all years are selected. Now we only select 2012, 13, and 14. If I click again, we are back to the entire selection. You just have to be aware of the fact that if we want to select individual years, you have to press this button again. Now we have these grayed out values, and if I now select 2015, for example, I only select this year. So it's important to understand that the background color we define here for the values, so this background color here, is the default color for unselected values, so to say. So these are the core options behind the slicer. By the way, if you want to get rid of this slicer name here, this is not in the general area, this title selection, but instead individual options. If you scroll down, then you can switch off the slicer header. With this, our visual looks better, I think. And if we now further reduce the size, maybe like this, and maybe drag it down a bit, then this overall look has improved. What we can also do is, of course, we can reselect all our values like this. Now we have our visuals back at the initial state. With the first steps being done in the slicer, we'll come back to the slicer in this module though, we can now also have a look at two more important aspects when creating visuals. This is the concept behind the default summarization and behind the sorting order of the data displayed in our visuals.